All right, your book is iconic, obviously, right? So, what wisdom from the first print of your book, again, back to 1989, The Wealthy Barber, do you think still holds true today?
You know, interesting. I just did a full rewrite of it. I'm finishing up over the next week, and I'd say most of it. The specifics certainly have to be changed in many instances, but the general wisdom of living within your means, paying yourself first, which I think was the primary message of the book, and certainly the one that was remembered most by people, those have held their way. And I think my insurance beliefs really didn't change a whole lot between now and then, and trying to look for the most tax efficient ways to save. New opportunities have come up in both Canada and the States, but the general thrust, I think, stayed pretty much the same. But there have been some changes for sure. There have to been. There have been so many new products come online in both countries. Of course, in Canada, we've had the TFSAs and FHSAs, and now the popularity of ETFs. I am so old that when that book came out, ETFs weren't around.
That's
In
right.
fact, index funds weren't really heard of. They weren't mainstream at all, but ETFs hadn't even been put into the marketplace. So all of those changes have to be incorporated into the new manuscript. But the general teachings, the general push of the book, I think still hold true.
We weren't going to ask about it, but since you mentioned it, what are your insurance beliefs from that first book that still hold true today?
I'm a big advocate of buy term and invest the difference. And it's interesting, Ben. I don't have anything against the insurance industry or the other products out there. It's nothing like that. But I don't think anybody's put more work into the math of analyzing this than I have. When the book came out in '89, I took a lot of criticism from the industry. A lot of people obviously were pushing cash value insurance, and I think believed wholeheartedly, by the way, that it was the right way to go. And so they were firing a lot of bullets at me. It wasn't easy. I was a young guy. Nobody likes taking criticism. I still don't like it, and I'm old. And I said, okay, I've got to make sure I'm bang on here. And I worked with University of Waterloo people. I worked with actuaries. I mean, I put so much work into it. And the bottom line is 99% of people should be buying term and investing the difference.
Hmm.
It's still the way to go to this day, especially with all the tax advantage containers that are available out there in both countries. And so haven't changed on that front. And I think that chapter really has stood the test of time. I put a lot of work in writing it way back in '87, '88 to try to make it as understandable as possible. And even in this rewrite, it was the part of the book that changed the least. I
Hmm.
added a few things, but it didn't undergo major changes.
So, Dave, if someone were to find a copy of that first edition in a used bookstore somewhere, is there any advice that you made in the first book that you would actually tell people to ignore today? Not just sort of, well, products have changed, but just any advice that you've thought differently about?
Yeah, I mean, I pushed aggressively cheering for the Detroit Tigers. They've won nothing basically since then. So that was not well done. They've gone the
It's
whole time
true.
without winning. But I think that, obviously I talked a lot about mutual funds at that point. They were really the only opportunity for people to buy into professional money management on the equity front. And, I was wrong. I was wrong, and not wrong, I wouldn't say, because the other products weren't available at that point. But the problem, as you guys know better than anybody with mutual funds, has been the high fees, particularly in Canada. In the States, they tend to be more competitive. Canada has among, if not the highest, mutual fund fees in the world, often 2 to 2.5%. Remember, we went through a run there in the '90s where they sometimes hit 3 and 3.25%
Yep.
on some of the big funds. It was absolutely crazy. And I was under the feeling at that time that there were ways to scientifically attack this and pick what were likely to be the better performing mutual funds going forward. Not just studying past track records, but if you're willing to reading the reports, the thinking of the manager, et cetera. Well, let's be honest, that's been proven to be completely wrong. Nobody can pick the future mutual fund winners. And I wasn't the only person who felt that way. There was an industry that built up around it. You had the guides coming out every year, and some of them were very well done. Gordon Pape, a very smart, very well meaning guy, put a lot of work into trying to push people towards what could be the winning funds in the future. We had in the US Morningstar rating all the funds, et cetera. Well, none of them have been able to do it. Very few do, in fact, outperform the broad market averages, and picking the ones who are going to ahead of time is impossible. And so that would change and has changed, did change in the Wealthy Barber return, certainly won't be pushed at all in the redo of the Wealthy Barber. But another thing that jumps at me is I was very much in the camp, if I can get you to pay yourself first, to take that 10 to 15% off the top, we're in pretty good shape here. I don't care what you do with the rest of your money. The problem is not long after the book came out, credit became ubiquitously available.
Hmm.
Instead of just being providers of credit, the banking institutions ended up being pushers of credit. And so you had a lot of people who were paying themselves first and building up the asset side of their net worth statement, but were offsetting it on the liability side by taking on all of this debt. And so over time, I've had to talk more about how to control your spending, all of those types of things, avoiding the debt traps, bringing in more psychology to the book. In fact, The Wealthy Barber Returns had a lot of that, and I hope it impacted people positively. So those are two things that very much had to change. And then to your point, there are a lot of new products. And it's not just a matter of explaining what they are. People have to know, well, I can't do it all. How do I prioritize? Which ones make the most sense? What are the subtle nuances that surround each, et cetera? There's a lot to unpack. It's a little trickier, frankly, to write the book in this format with the dialogue and the bouncing back and forth with the new complexities that have come into the marketplace. It's taken me 13 months to do this. Strangely, it's taken me 1 month longer to write the revised version than it did to write the original, because there's more content, and again, a little trickier to keep it flowing and keep the conversation at a reasonable pace.
So that book, your first book, was wildly successful. How did the success of that book change your life?
Well, it was shocking. I mean, it really was. I remember at the time, a lot of people said, "Do you think you're going to be a one-hit wonder?" And my dad said, "That's one hit more than we thought you'd have." And I don't think anybody saw it coming. I self-published the book, and my goal was to sell 10,000 copies. And in fact, I cashed out my RRSP to print the book. So the entire book says, "Never touch your RRSP." And I hypocritically cashed out mine to print it. And I thought, the upward bound was probably 20,000. And then it started taking off its second year. Interestingly, it was a modest success its first year. And it changed my life on a lot of fronts. I mean, obviously, financially, it was, much more successful than I could have dreamt. And it led me into lots of other opportunities. In fact, I think the latter point's probably the more important, because it gave me some fame and some brand recognition. Other opportunities came my way, from publishing cookbooks to Dragon's Den, et cetera. It's been all positive. And I think it sounds corny, but the most important way it changed my life was it helped a lot of people. And so people have been very kind to me, very gracious over the years, and that's been very positive. I've met a lot of people and had strong connections through all of that, and it's been an exclusively positive experience. When you're a public figure, you do take some criticism and you have to develop a thicker skin, but for the most part, it's been wonderful. Now, all of those changes aside, for the most part, I've stayed the exact same guy. Like, I still live in a small house. I still live in Kitchener and Sarnia. I had the same friend groups in both cities that I've always had. I live a very, very straightforward life. I'm not a fancy guy at all. I don't have a lot of toys. My hobbies haven't changed very much. My golf game hasn't improved. None of that has really altered. So in many ways, it didn't change it, but it did open up a lot of opportunities, no question. Lucky stroke. I mean, to have that fall into my lap at such a young age. I mean, Ben, I've really only had one good idea in my life. Thank heavens I had it at age 25. That was a big blessing.
So I was a consumer of your book back when it came out, and I remember that time very well. It's before I was in the industry. Was there a tipping point or some event that happened where it really became popular? Because I remember all of my friends at the time were talking about the book and dollar cost averaging specifically. Was there something that happened?
Yeah, I think three things kind of came together and that really drove it. In the early part of 1990, one of the mutual fund companies bought it and gave it to all the reps as an educational tool. And that certainly got it some flow. The Canadian military bought a tremendous number of copies for all the trainees at Base Borden. I think 17, 18,000. I've forgotten the number now, but that's a lot of books by Canadian standards. And that seeded the market for word of mouth. And then Canada Trust actually started selling it in branches. And
Oh,
I
wow.
think that was huge, because not only did it move a lot of books, but it put the book into a location you normally wouldn't expect to see it in. And that really got a lot of attention. Back in that day, there was no online buying. So if you weren't a person who visited bookstores, you didn't really see the book. Now all of a sudden it's in Canada Trust and you're noticing it. And then the word of mouth started flying. And it really was a word of mouth driven book. In fact, it was a book that was unusual in terms
Yeah.
of the number of copy purchasers. People would buy 3, 4, and 5 for their kids, grandkids. A lot of companies started buying it for their employees. In fact, corporate sales were a big part of the success the book had. But I think that those were all part of the tipping point that happened in kind of March, April of 1990. And that's when it took off and kept a run up for 4 or 5 years. And even when I took it off the shelves years and years and years later, it was still selling well. The problem, it was so out of date that I was uncomfortable with some of what it was saying. And I didn't have time to do the rewrite, so I just pulled it off the shelves.
Now, Dave, speaking of that, it was a long time before you wrote the second book, The Wealthy Barber Returns, and you had actually said in the book that you were somewhat reluctant to write it. What finally convinced you to undertake doing a second book after such a long break?
Yeah, it was a long break. I think one shallow part of the answer and one deeper. I went on The Hour with George Stroumboulopoulos at some point, I think in 2009. Hadn't done a financial interview in a long time and really enjoyed it. I mean, I love George. I think he was a very underrated interviewer, and I liked being back and doing that. And that actually did play a role. Like I thought, you know what, maybe I'll go back out and do this again. But the bigger thing was just frustration. I was still helping a lot of people with their finances when people would send us things and we get so much you wouldn't believe it. I'd still go through it and reach back out to people and give them some guidance. And I would learn from them. In fact, often I learned more from them than they did from me. But it's pretty frustrating when you're doing that. I was seeing how much debt was being taken on. And of course, that's remained the case. Canada's debt levels are just absolutely insane. And also was seeing the poor investment returns people were earning relative to the broad market averages, like very poor. And so looking at those two things, I got frustrated and thought, how can I make a difference? And again, this sounds corny, but anytime you write a book, you're looking to help. You know, you're looking to get out there and help people to manage their money better, to change their lives in some positive way. And so I was quite motivated to do it. Took a year to write the book, and then it came out, and really had a lot of fun marketing it for a while. But then Dragon's Den came out of nowhere and ended up aborting the marketing efforts and focusing exclusively on the show. But to this day, I'm actually really proud of the second book. I'm one of the only people who likes it better than the first one. I think everybody loves the first book because of its unique format. But I'm really quite proud of the second one.
You mentioned you're finishing up a new book, a rewrite. What sections in the forthcoming book are you most excited to, share with the world?
I'm excited about the whole thing. And I mean, all authors say that about their books, obviously, especially when they're just finishing up because they're excited to be done. It's hard work. But I really am. We test the books as we write them, and it's going over well. And when you test a book like this, where it's dialogue based, it's such an unusual approach, setting it in the barbershop and using the novel format. The testing is so important because the people in that market say, I didn't understand this yet, or what about this? And that's where you come up with a lot of the questions and you incorporate them into the manuscript. So I'm excited about the whole thing, but I think we can explain some of the concepts out there more clearly. When I run my podcast or you listen to Rational Reminder, we're drawing in audiences that are already relatively well informed. And it's easy for us to forget that the vast majority of people out there still don't even know what an ETF is. They don't know what investing for long-term growth means, all of these types of things. And so a lot of this, again, is going back to basics and saying, here's what you need to know in an understandable fashion. The good news is most of the complicated, tricky stuff doesn't work, as you three know. And so I say that very clearly. But honestly, I'm quite excited about the whole thing. I think it's going to have a big impact. And one small way that I think differentiates the opportunity this time from all those years ago was we've had this huge influx of immigrants in Canada. And a lot of them, of course, didn't grow up in households in Canada speaking about the Canadian financial system. They don't have a lot of experience with it. They don't know the jargon to the same extent that somebody who's lived here for 20 and 25 years may. And I think the book can really help that group too, as they try to become acquainted with TFSAs or whether you pay off your mortgage before you go that route, all of those things. And so I think that could be a bit of a difference maker too.
What convinced you to write this upcoming book?
Well, my kids played a role. They're kind of at the time I decided to write it a couple of years ago. They're early 30s. They're 33, 35 now type thing. And they were saying, hey, a refreshed book would help us. It would help everybody in our age group. And of course, the housing affordability challenges make everybody very, very nervous about money management. And can you deal with some of that? So can you put it all together? Jim O'Shaughnessy, Patrick O'Shaughnessy from Invest Like the Best both said, right, why aren't you doing an updated version of this at some point? And then Rob Carrick, a person I have a lot of respect for, and I think you've had Rob on the podcast, and he talked about, I can't believe you're not going to do it one more time. And I'm getting old, to be honest. I'm 63. And so you start thinking, if I am going to do it, I better do it soon. And so I started putting it together. But the hardest part has been the housing affordability challenge. A lot of what I taught back in '89 is tough for the average income person to do now. so much of their income is heading towards housing costs, not just the outsized mortgages either, but property taxes have risen at a greater than inflation rate pace, et cetera. We'll talk, I'm sure, more about home ownership later. So it's tricky for a lot of people out there. It's very tight. The cost of living is extremely high. How do you do all of this? Well, the answer for most people is you don't do all of it. So you really do have to figure out, okay, if I can only do some of it, how do I prioritize? And I just thought it was the right time to do the revision to the book. And again, my age definitely played a role. I might not have the opportunity to do it in a few years. I know I look
So
young,
Dave,
guys. I know with this shirt and this hair, you're probably thinking, Dave, you look young, but I am not young, sadly.
So, Dave, in addition to the third book, you've got a number of videos that you've created. You've got a podcast now, as you chatted about. So, my question is, what took you so long to realize that print media is dead and that people only want videos and podcasts now?
Well, yeah, you know what? I'm worried about that. I mean, when you have a book coming out, you're worried about the ADD that has swept society. I find myself battling ADD to the nth degree now. And, it's definitely affected sales of nonfiction books. Fiction's actually selling quite well right now, especially romance-related fiction. But nonfiction books have struggled with all of this. And you're right, it did take me a long time to come around to this, which is funny because I really enjoy a lot of the YouTube videos I see on the investing world. Love podcasts like yours. But we decided to dip our toe in, not monetizing it in any way. So we're not taking any advertising dollars. We're not selling any products. We're not doing lead gen. And our plan is to stay that way. Like we're not looking to monetize this. This is really, again, it sounds corny, but trying to give back and educate people. They want to go to a source they know they can trust, that they're not being sold something. There's not something in the background that's influencing the advice, and put it all together. But I have to say that a small part of it too was I got frustrated with Canadians not embracing FHSAs when they first came out. I was a little bit out of the financial business. And when I first saw the FHSA announcements and the explanations, I'm like, this is the greatest thing ever. Like, I mean, how are people not grabbing a hold of this? And as you guys know, the penetration rate in the first year or so was very low. And so I got frustrated with that. And that drew me back in a little bit to, writing a script and goofing around. And we put out a video on that. It went over very well. And I thought, hey, why don't we tackle this? And then the podcast kind of flowed from that naturally, and it's been a lot of fun. So it's been a great experience so far. I've really enjoyed the whole thing and being back in front of the camera and trying to use a little humor and make it understandable. And it's interesting how different our two properties are. I mean, the videos are 2 to 3 minutes, just me trying to fire out things quickly. And then, of course, the podcast is long form with the guest driving. So they're very different. The hardest part by far is in the short videos covering off the subtle nuances. If you just give out there and educate or give advice, you could steer people in the wrong direction if you don't say, yeah, but watch out for this, or that may not apply to you. And I'm very sensitive to all that. So trying to weave that in and not mislead people, but keep it relatively short and keep it hopping, that's very difficult to do. You have to put a fair amount of time into creating these 2 and 3 minute scripts because of that.
Oh yeah, totally. It's tough to strike that balance.
Very tough.
You mentioned earlier that your book gave you some fame and some notoriety, which opened a lot of cool doors. So I got to ask, what is the best part about being the wealthy barber?
I think two things, both a result of all the feedback we get. It's nice when people are always reaching out saying, you made a huge difference. We get letters and texts and emails literally every day from people saying, I retired early because of the wealthy barber. I mean, 2.1 million copies sold in Canada and a lot more in the US as well. And then the pass on rate was very high. So the number of people who read it and were influenced in some way, and then they take the time to reach back out to you, that's wonderful. But also from my selfish perspective, the learning that's come from that. You and I have talked off air, Ben, about the number of people who send me their comprehensive financial plans, their spending summaries, their investment portfolios, et cetera. It's been a great way to learn. I mean, I've said this in interviews and it sounds dramatic, but it's true. I doubt anybody in the world has seen more financial plans and more people's finances than I have. At the peak of the wealthy barber, or even during 2008, 2009 type thing, we were getting thousands a year coming through. Now, obviously, you're not looking at all of them in depth, but I'm looking at some of them. And I learned a tremendous amount. I think I learned more from that. It also made the revised version of the wealthy barber better because you're seeing all this frontline stuff. Where are people going wrong? What are they doing right psychologically? What are they most struggling with, et cetera, et cetera. So I think just dealing with the public and all the feedback and all the learnings that have come from that have been a great part of it. And then again, selfishly, it opened up a lot of doors. If I hadn't had that self-published success, Janet and Greta Podleski, the Looney Spoon sisters, would have never found me. And that obviously led to a dynasty for them. They were just so clever and so talented. And then Dragon's Den flowed from that, and that's been a lot of fun. And so I've been very blessed. I mean, I've really enjoyed my career. I get quite sad when I think about how old I am. I really do. I've loved my life. I've had a lot of things go my way, fantastic parents, health. My kids have been healthy and happy. And, I really enjoy things. And I don't get down very often, but the speed of time can knock me down a bit. I hate the fact that time is flying by this quickly.
I you got to expand a little bit on the Podletsky story, because that's an insane story. Just like a 30-second for the
Well, I
audience,
mean,
because they're going to be.
yeah, two sisters who just literally, I would say, stalked me to try to get me involved in their cookbook. They were to the point of actually being a bit scary. And then I kept saying no. And then finally, I took the manuscript. I flew back from Ottawa, and I happened to stop in to see my parents. And I showed my mom. And my mom looked at it. Well, my dad and I were catching up on sports and said, I love this book. You should get involved. And it's all because of my mom I did. And of course, it ended up setting pretty much every Canadian publishing record. And they've gone on to have 5 more. Greta's on her own now, and Janet went a different direction. And they've had 6 consecutive books. Greta's been involved in all 6 that have gone to #1 in the country of any type of book. They've had excellent US success on QVC and in the bookstores. We had frozen foods, greeting cards, kitchen utensils. Who would have believed it? All from this idea. But they're immensely talented. They really are. And it was a lot of fun. That was a wonderful experience in my life.